Hello and welcome to Top Story. More violence in Kenya, where police on Wednesday fought with opposition demonstrators protesting against last month's disputed elections. At least 3 people are believed to have died when police opened fire. The worst clashes occurred in Kisumu in western Kenya, when several hundred protesters attempted to march into the town centre. But there was violence too in Mombasa on the coast and in the capital Nairobi. More than 600 people have died and 250,000 been forced to abandon their homes since President Mwai Kibaki claimed victory in the elections at the end of December. According to the official figures, Kibaki had a razor-thin majority over opposition candidate Raila Odinga of the Orange Democratic Movement. Odinga claims the vote was rigged and has refused to accept the outcome. International and domestic observers have also expressed concern about the vote on various counts. It appears that ethnic antagonisms, which have been at the core of many of Kenya's problems since independence, underlie the electoral tensions. Well, joining me now to discuss the latest developments is Douglas Yates, Professor of Political Science at the American University of Paris. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. No sign of the tension letting up in Kenya. What seems to be at the core of the problem?
Well, the core of the problem that's been defined now is ethnic tension, and it's probably important to talk about that first because a lot of people are worried that Kenya might go the direction of Rwanda. But there are other issues, and I think that the proximate causes of this might be the failure of constitutional reform, that is the failure to create a non-presidential system where some power sharing could go on. I think the success of democracy, for the first time you have a real competition, a real struggle for power that's very narrow. And then also the anti-corruption and the privatization campaigns that have been pushed by international organizations are beginning to have the political instability effects that many people had worried about back in the 80s and 90s.
You mentioned ethnicity. This is a problem that's bedeviled Kenya ever since independence. Is it the case that the 2 main political organizations split along ethnic lines?
Well, there certainly is a heavy ethnic component now, but it is important to know that in Kenya, nation building was more successful than in a lot of the surrounding regions. This is a state that didn't have a nation, and the goal of Jomo Kenyatta had been to build nationalism, and the instrument for that had been KANU, had been a party that had struggled for independence. The problem was the Kikuyu had played the major role in that through the Kikuyu Central Organization, where KANU ended up being dominated by 2 ethnicities, the Kikuyu and the Luo. And Odinga's father, Oginga Odinga, had actually been in a power-sharing agreement with Jomo Kenyatta, a Kikuyu, and that agreement had been broken. And so for 40 years, there's been a bitterness between the Luo and the Kikuyu. Tom Mboya, a very famous Luo politician, was assassinated.
Just sorry to interrupt, but does that tension that exists between those 2 ethnic groups threaten to undermine the nation building that has been going on in Kenya since independence?
Well, not in the way that the Rwanda crisis had turned into a genocide. But right now what we have is a demand by the Luo after decades for their moment of power. And there had been a deal. In the last presidential election, it had been between Mwai Kibaki, a Kikuyu, and Uhuru Kenyatta, a Kikuyu. The difference with this election was now you had a Kikuyu going in an electoral competition against a Luo with decades of understanding and broken agreements that the Luo would have their day.
There's no sign of backing down from either side in this conflict at the moment, is there? The opposition Orange Democratic Movement says 3 days of demonstrations, the first one we've just had. The government saying we're not going to back down on this. How do you see it developing?
I would use, by a comparative politics approach, I would move out of Africa and I'd look at Mexico in its last election. For a very long time, Mexico had been ruled by a single party. And then you had a democratization process. You had an opposition party leader who came to power. And then you had a challenge after this breaking open. And for a very long time after the last Mexican presidential elections, the opposition continued to claim that it had won victory. But gradually, the longer the claims went on, the longer the process was dragged out, gradually the sitting president had an advantage. And so in this case, I think Mwai Kibaki's best strategy is to wait.
To sit it out. You don't see him backing down?
No, he has no interest in backing down, nor in a rapid solution to the conflict.
I suppose an additional complication for him is that the opposition has a majority in Parliament.
Yes, and they've managed to actually elect the Speaker of the Parliament. Now, this was the failed constitutional reform. There's no Prime Minister, and the Speaker of the Parliament is like Nancy Pelosi in the United States, and even worse because she has very limited powers in a heavily presidential system that was designed by Kenyatta and particularly his successor, Moi.
You don't see then that the Parliament can seriously politically embarrass Kibaki?
Yes, it can, and this is the wonderful thing. When you start to actually have competition going through your government institutions, you might enter into a phase where parliamentary power, Parliament, instead of being a rubber stamp of a single party, Parliament can become a place of debate and opposition. But for the moment, most power is in the hand of the President.
Well, what about the wider implications of this? I'm thinking of the region as a whole, because Kenya is a big economic power in Eastern Africa. Could there be a knock-on effect?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for regional trade, Kenya serves as the coastal state for many of the landlocked countries like Uganda to the west. So the shutdown of transportation to the Rift Valley or to the Lakes region is a real problem for the countries in the interior. Also, I think Kenya has been playing an increasingly important role in financial investment. The Nairobi Stock Exchange, this is an important stock exchange in the region. It's lost $500 million in value since Christmas time. And there's questions of international debt repayment, scheduling of debt, interest rates going up. So the ripple effects will be large.
What about the wider effect of African morale? I mean, Kenya has been a success story of sorts in Africa. If Kenya is seen to fail, what will the implications for Africa as a whole be?
Well, unfortunately, probably not very great, but certainly probably the neighbors will be happy after so many years of Kenya shining in the light to see that Kenya has its turn as well to deal with structural problems of post-colonialism.
What about international pressure? Because we've seen Kofi Annan has been their former head of the UN. What sort of international pressure is being put on both sides in this conflict now?
Right. Well, Kenya has a very important role as an English-speaking country in Africa, which makes therefore an ideal partner for the United States. Kenya is also a Christian country, and the United States foreign policy, worried about radical Islamic terrorism, has adopted Kenya as its natural partner in the region. Kenya abuts countries with which the United States has terrible relations, and so the United States was the first one to send an envoy. Jendai Fraser went in, the U.S. Undersecretary for African Affairs, but she didn't seem to have any effect whatsoever. So then former UN head Kofi Annan went in, didn't seem to have any effect at all. Then the AU sent John Kufuor in. The AU didn't seem to have any effect at all. So what I'm actually counting on is China intervening.
Okay, and with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to our guest, Douglas Yates of the American University of Paris. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye.